For more on the meeting, we turn to Andrew Latham. He's a professor of international relations at Macalester College. First of all, thank you for joining us. Second, Trump said there's a sticking point. Where do you see the biggest differences between the two leaders?
Well, I imagine they had touched on a number of topics that were simply bilateral. American-Russian relations having to do with the Arctic, perhaps, or nuclear arms control deals, things like that. But the big topic, the big sticking point, the big fly in the ointment, of course, is Ukraine. And there the two sides simply don't agree. Let me put it this way. Putin he talks about root causes. He talks about the impossibility of a ceasefire that doesn't address the root causes, and therefore the impossibility of a permanent peace that doesn't address the root causes. And the root causes are his causes. He wants to annex the Donbass. He wants to neutralize Kyiv. He doesn't want any NATO membership, things like that. Once upon a time in the not-too-distant past, I think President Trump would have happily gone along with a lot of that if he could get a deal, because the United States, in his view, doesn't have any vested interests in Ukraine, and it does have some vested interests in a better relationship with Russia. Weaning it off its relationship with China, for example, might be one element of that. More recently, though, President Trump's line has hardened considerably, to some extent because of European and Ukrainian pressure. You can't do a deal between the United States and Russia that has to do with the future of Ukraine. Ukraine has to be at the table. Prime Minister Starmer in Britain gets that, President Macron in France gets that, Chancellor Merz gets that, and President Zelensky gets that. And so that, I think, is the big sticking point. Whatever else they might have agreed on the margins of the meeting, gentlemen's agreements, handshakes, that sort of thing, didn't touch on the big issue, the elephant in the room, which has to be the Ukraine.
Andrew, you're bringing in a very interesting point, because this is an interaction, a game where allies in the West, including Ukraine, seem to be all having influence over the other, much to a behavior that Donald Trump doesn't seem to follow. So how do you see further consultations to follow after this, and maybe leading to a breakthrough on Ukraine amongst these allies?
Well, I think there's going to be continued pressure from the Western Europeans and other American partners and allies. They're going to push because they want a just peace. Not any peace, not peace at any price, but a just peace. And that means respecting some of Ukraine's concerns and interests. Now, I think we have to distinguish between a ceasefire, which is short to medium term, and a permanent peace, which is long term. I think it might be possible to get to a ceasefire. The Russians might bend on that, providing they could hold on to the territory that they've conquered and keep Ukraine out of NATO, etc. And the Ukrainians are simply on the verge of losing this war, and I think just want it to end before they do lose it. So there might be that. The prospects for a long-term peace agreement of the kind that has ended various wars, including the one between Azerbaijan and Armenia recently, I don't see the prospects for that. I think the most hopeful long-term scenario is the Korean scenario. A ceasefire, an armistice, which is agreed, which was meant to be temporary, which now in the Korean case has lasted for over half a century. And I think that's the best scenario one can envision with respect to Ukraine and Russia. But even that is difficult, because I don't think President Putin and President Zelensky are actually going to do what President Trump and President Putin did today, which is to sit down in the same room and perhaps talk honestly about their differences.
And I'd like to continue along this line and try to better understand how might this summit affect the dynamics amongst the U.S. and the Russian sides. How do you think they're moving forward?
I think both parties have an interest in improving relations, bilateral relations. The Russians want out from under sanctions, and they don't want to be isolated on the world stage. So score one up for Putin. He's already got the red carpet treatment, literally, let alone metaphorically. And so the isolation may be over, but he wants out from under the sanctions too. And the United States has an interest in improving relations with Russia, because it doesn't want to see Russia and China and India in the BRICS opposing American order and American interests on the world stage. So both have an interest in improving their relations. And the fact that the two leaders emerged from this summit today smiling and to some extent congratulating and praising each other, I think is a very good sign in terms of the interpersonal dimension between the two presidents. I think it's a sign that on the economic front and on the arms control front and some other fronts, there might be some scope for forward motion there. That all looks very positive, but also very marginal if you're in Kyiv. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the war. I think no progress was made there, with the possible minor exception of this, that it might have set the stage for a follow-on summit, which is not bilateral, but trilateral.
Andrew Latham, thank you so much for your time and insights.
You're welcome.